There are alliances that don't break apart in war nor collapse with the tearing of a treaty. Some unravel in silence, when trust is slowly drained away bit by bit, when France and Germany openly declare that they no longer see the United States as a reliable partner, and when Canada quietly begins building a new security framework with Europe without involving Washington. That's no longer just a policy disagreement. It's a sign of a world order shifting beneath our feet. What has led America's closest allies to this decision, and how long will the consequences last? Let's break it down right now. If you care about deep, clear, and non-sensational geopolitical analysis, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the stories quietly reshaping the world. There are moments in geopolitics when the global order doesn't crumble because of war, nor disintegrate from a broken treaty. It begins with words, not threats from enemies, but warnings spoken by the very allies once bound the closest. When diplomatic language, usually used to smooth over cracks, is suddenly cast aside, what's left is often the raw and unsettling truth. On January 8, 2026, at the Élysée Palace in Paris, the President of France stood before all French ambassadors worldwide and didn't hold back. He stated plainly that the United States, the country once seen as the cornerstone of the post-World II international order, is now turning its back on its allies and actively dismantling the very rules it once built and protected for decades. This wasn't an emotional complaint, nor an academic analysis. It was a cold summary, spoken aloud when all illusions had run out. Just one day earlier, in Berlin, the president of Germany went even further. He described the world as sliding into a den of thieves, where the strong take whatever they want and regions, even entire nations, are treated like property of a few great powers. And the most shocking part wasn't the metaphor, it was who he was talking about, the United States. He called it a moral decay, coming from the very partner who once played a key role in building the post-1945 world order. 2 speeches, 2 power centers of Europe, 2 consecutive days. Nothing about this was coincidental. In diplomacy, timing is rarely accidental. When warnings are issued in public, no longer softened by careful language, it means private channels have failed. And when allies begin speaking to each other through public forums, it's a sign that trust has fractured deeply. In this context, Canada becomes a particularly interesting link. Not because Ottawa is speaking out more harshly than Europe, but because Canada has chosen a different path, a silent restructuring. No fiery speeches against Washington, no declarations of a break. But every small decision, every quiet step is subtly reshaping Canada's place within the Western structure. Canada understands something Europe is also beginning to grasp. The old order doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes, little by little, through unpredictability, through needless threats, and through the gradual decoupling of power from responsibility. When trust is no longer a stable foundation, countries don't wait for full collapse. They begin building alternatives in advance. And it's at this point that the story shifts from words to actions. When warnings stop being diplomatic, strategic decisions no longer need ceremonial announcements. They happen quietly, practically, and are hard to reverse. Canada, as both a close ally of the US and a country with its own distinct identity, is where this shift becomes most visible. To understand why the Western order is changing from within, we need to look at the moment Canada turned. A turn not marked by a farewell speech, but by the newly elected Prime Minister's first official destination. And from that seemingly small decision, a much larger transformation began to emerge. In modern Canadian history, there are certain rituals that don't need to be written into law, yet are followed as if they were. One of those is the tradition of the newly elected Prime Minister making their first official foreign visit to Washington. Not out of ceremony, but out of recognition of the power structure. It's how Ottawa reaffirms that its strategic choices still revolve around its relationship with the United States, the backbone of Canada's security and economy for decades. That's why the moment Mark Carney didn't appear in Washington sent a ripple of stunned silence through the observer community. There was no announcement breaking with tradition, no official explanation, but that absence said more than any press release ever could. When Carney stepped off a plane in Paris and then continued on to London, it wasn't just a scheduling decision. It was a strategic signal sent through action. In Paris, the reception for Carney didn't resemble the usual diplomatic pleasantries. The atmosphere felt more like alignment than ceremony. The two sides spoke to each other not as nations weighing their interests, but as partners recognizing a shared challenge. When Carney said that Canada is the most European country outside of Europe, it wasn't a throwaway line for headlines. It was a declaration of strategic identity. Canada wasn't presenting itself as an American satellite, but as a natural extension of the broader Atlantic political security space. From Paris to London, that message was reinforced. Meetings in the UK, from government offices to the royal family, carried powerful symbolism, but what mattered more was the deeper meaning beneath. Canada was reconnecting with a historic axis, one older and more rooted than its relationship with Washington. British media called it a return, and that wasn't entirely wrong. But in today's context, it's more than a return. It's an anchoring to a set of values and a structure that Canada finds more predictable, more manageable. These moves didn't take place in a political vacuum. They happened in parallel with openly hostile signals from the United States, threats of tariffs, trade pressure, and statements treating Canada as a country that could be absorbed. For a nation that places sovereignty and political dignity at its core, this wasn't just offensive. It was a sign that the partnership had shifted into dangerously unbalanced territory. When Carney, speaking from London, declared that such rhetoric was unacceptable and that the bilateral relationship could not continue without mutual respect, he wasn't speaking like a leader lashing out in anger. He was drawing a line. For the first time in decades, a Canadian Prime Minister publicly set conditions for Washington, rather than quietly adjusting to maintain harmony. But the key point isn't in the words, it's in what's happening behind the scenes. Ottawa's reassessment of key defense contracts, its serious discussions with European partners on security cooperation, and especially its questions about dependence on U.S. technology and supply chains, all of it signals that the shift has gone beyond symbolism. Canada is no longer just sending messages. It's preparing for a new structure. What's notable is how these moves deliberately avoid drama. No dramatic break, no provocative gestures. Everything is being done as if these were just necessary technical adjustments in a changing world. And that calmness is what makes this shift so dangerous to the old order, because the quiet changes are often the hardest ones to reverse. When a country begins to reorient its strategic partnerships, reevaluate its security foundations, and reconnect with structures outside its usual orbit, that's no longer a short-term reaction. It's preparation for a long-term order. And when enough of these non-ceremonial decisions are made, they naturally crystallize into policy. From here, the story moves beyond symbolic visits or individual speeches. It enters a deeper phase, where Canada begins taking part in Europe's institutional security frameworks. When choices are encoded into agreements and goodwill is translated into structure, that shift no longer belongs to a single prime minister. It becomes the trajectory of an entire nation. In geopolitics, there's a fine line between symbolism and structure. Symbols can attract attention, spark media resonance, but only structure shapes the long-term behavior of nations. And it's precisely at that boundary where Canada has taken its most decisive step since the Cold War, not through loud declarations, but by placing itself within a new security framework, one where the United States is no longer the central pillar. On June 23, 2025, when Canada and the European Union signed the Security and Defense Partnership Agreement, many outside observers saw it as a sensible diplomatic move in an increasingly unstable world. But to those who understand how power operates, this moment went far beyond routine diplomacy. For the first time in modern history, Canada committed to a long-term security framework where Washington isn't the axis. No longer flexible bilateral cooperation, but an institutional network defined by clear rules, standards, and aligned interests. This agreement doesn't talk much about war, but it speaks volumes about control over defense supply chains, control over digital infrastructure, control over the defining technologies of the 21st century, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and command and control systems. For decades, Canada was used to these standards being set in Washington, then cascading through the rest of the Western world. Now, those standards are beginning to take shape in Brussels, Paris, and Berlin, with Ottawa actively at the table. The implications go much deeper than what's written on paper. By agreeing to co-standardize with Europe, Canada's defense procurement decisions are no longer just about price or performance. They become strategic choices about dependence. A radar system, a data platform, or a command software integrated to European specs will automatically exclude many suppliers outside that ecosystem. And among those gradually excluded, American corporations are no longer default frontrunners. Canada's negotiations to join the EU's collective defense procurement mechanism, SAFE, are the logical next step in this cool, calculated shift. SAFE is not just a fund or a program. It's a tool of power. When countries pool demand, align standards, and sign long-term contracts, they create a market large enough to shape the industry. To join SAFE is for Canada to accept that a portion of its defense capacity will now be anchored in the European industrial sphere, rather than drifting within the old Atlantic inertia with Washington at the center. For Ottawa, this isn't an anti-American move. It's a safeguard, a recalibration to ensure that, should the old order continue to erode, Canada won't find itself locked into a system it can no longer steer or predict. When Prime Minister Carney called SAFE a force multiplier, he wasn't just referring to financial scale. He was talking about the ability to turn today's policy choices into tomorrow's actual capabilities without needing Washington's silent approval. What's most striking about this entire process lies in the silences. The United States is hardly mentioned, not because it's been forgotten, but because it's no longer the mandatory point of reference. In geopolitics, not being mentioned can be more worrying than being criticized. It suggests a center of power is being systematically bypassed. Once structure starts operating, symbols become secondary. Contracts are signed, standards are adopted, technical working groups meet regularly, and brick by brick, a new security order is being built, quietly but firmly. This is the kind of change that a single presidency or even a short-term policy reversal will struggle to undo. It's at this moment that Canada's quiet moves begin to echo loudly across Europe. Once the structure is in place, European leaders no longer have reason to remain silent. The doubts once whispered behind closed doors are now spoken aloud. And from that point, the story moves into a new phase. A phase where Europe not only acts, but openly declares that its trust in the United States as an irreplaceable pillar has come to an end. For a very long time, doubt within the transatlantic relationship existed only as a whisper. It surfaced in internal memos, behind closed-door meetings, and in the careful phrasing diplomats used in private. But by early 2026, whispers were no longer enough. Europe began to say aloud what it had long thought, and once spoken in public, it ceased to be an emotional reaction and became a political decision. In the first days of January, 2 back-to-back speeches from Paris and Berlin shattered a long-standing taboo, directly criticizing the United States as a source of instability in the international order. The French president didn't resort to vague diplomatic language. He stated plainly that European societies are now asking questions they never had to ask before. Could Greenland be threatened by force? Could Canada be coerced into annexation? Could places like Taiwan become bargaining chips in a new power logic? These were no longer academic hypotheticals. They were concrete security fears. In Berlin, the tone was even colder. The German president described a world sliding into lawlessness, where those willing to trample norms gain the upper hand. And the shock wasn't in the diagnosis, it was in the subject. He was speaking not of the West's traditional adversaries, but of the United States itself. When he called this a historic rupture point, it marked Europe's acknowledgement that a once foundational relationship had now become a variable. What matters isn't the harshness of the language, it's the timing and the context. These statements came on the heels of several actions from Washington that Europe saw as crossing the line, from the detention of a sovereign Latin American leader on U.S. soil to public remarks floating the possibility of seizing Allied territory. For Europe, this was no longer about the temperament of a particular American president. It had become a behavioral pattern, and once a pattern is recognized, patience runs out. Europe understood it could no longer base its security on outdated assumptions, that the U.S. would always act within the rules it once championed. Trust, once eroded long enough, collapses quickly. And when it collapses, The greatest danger isn't confrontation, it's prolonged silence. That's why Europe chose to speak up. These statements weren't meant to sever ties with Washington. They were meant to send a signal to the entire international system. Europe is redefining its position. No longer a bloc dependent by default on the American security umbrella, but a power center preparing to defend itself, even against risks that come from allies. And in that process, Canada emerged as a natural partner. What Ottawa had done quietly was now aligned with what Europe was saying out loud. These two currents met at a common point: the shared need to defend sovereignty and order through collective action, without going through Washington. It's no coincidence that immediately after those forceful declarations, a seemingly remote location became the focal point of strategic discussions. Greenland, home to just a few tens of thousands, suddenly became a symbol of a new red line. When the territory of an ally becomes the object of bargaining and threat, the entire alliance system is forced to answer a core question: who will stand up for the rules? Europe gave its answer. And for the first time in modern history, Canada stood alongside, not as a follower, but as a partner bearing shared responsibility. From blunt statements about the collapse of trust, the story swiftly moved to concrete action. And it was Greenland, the icy landmass in the Arctic, that became the trigger point for a new alliance, where Canada and Europe stood side by side to declare, there are lines that cannot be crossed, no matter who the challenger is. There are places in the world that only become important when the global order begins to crack. Greenland is one of them. For decades, this icy island existed on the fringes of the global power map, mentioned more often in scientific reports on melting ice and climate change than in high-level security meetings. But when open territorial threats were voiced from Washington, Greenland instantly became the ultimate test for the entire Western alliance system. To Europe, Greenland is not just a territory of Denmark. It's a symbol of the principle of sovereign inviolability, the foundational principle Europe has relied on to survive 2 world wars. When that principle is challenged, not by a traditional adversary, but by its number one ally, the stakes change immediately. This is no longer an academic debate about Arctic geopolitics. It's an existential question about whether the rules of the game still exist. Canada understood this earlier than most. As an Arctic nation and Greenland's direct neighbor in geostrategic space, Ottawa could clearly see the consequences of letting this precedent stand. If Greenland can be threatened, then no boundary is truly secure. And when the Canadian Prime Minister appeared in Paris and stood beside European leaders to speak about defending Greenland's sovereignty, it wasn't a symbolic gesture of unity. It was a deliberate choice to take a stand for the rules. The joint declaration by 7 European nations and Canada in defense of Greenland and Denmark was an unprecedented moment. For the first time, NATO allies openly rallied not to counter a threat from outside the bloc, but to reject a claim coming from within. There were no harsh words, no accusations, but the omission of the name of the party being rejected only made the message clearer. Everyone understood. And so did Washington. Canada's announcement of a new consulate in Greenland shortly after made the shift even more explicit. This was not a routine diplomatic move. A consulate represents long-term presence, political and strategic commitment. It is a nation's way of saying, we are here and we're not leaving. For Ottawa, Greenland became a new Arctic anchor, not via Washington, but through Copenhagen and Europe's capitals. What's striking is that Europe's reaction wasn't emotional. There was no wave of public outrage, no calls for confrontation. Instead, there was cold, calculated coordination. Statements were timed with precision. Meetings were held on the sidelines of pre-planned summits. Everything about it indicated this was not a spontaneous response. It was the product of quiet preparation, with Greenland merely the final trigger. It was at this point that the Canada-Europe alliance shifted into a new state. No longer just an alignment of abstract values, but concrete action to defend a specific geographic space. And once that action had been taken, the question was no longer whether Washington would walk back its threat. The question was, can things ever return to the way they were? The realistic answer is no. Because what was triggered by the Greenland moment wasn't just a political reaction, it was a structural shift. New security coordination channels were reinforced. Consultation mechanisms were activated more frequently, without the US at the center. And most importantly, decisions around infrastructure, from defense procurement to diplomatic presence, began to take form. When a nation builds a consulate, signs long-term contracts, standardizes supply chains, and reroutes strategic cooperation, it is no longer making a temporary choice. It is laying down the infrastructure of power. And once that infrastructure is in place, no conciliatory statement can undo it overnight. From Greenland, the story entered a deeper, less reversible phase, one in which the absence of the United States at the center is no longer a political choice, but the inevitable consequence of new structures that have already taken shape. There's a common illusion in international politics that simply changing leadership can reset everything back to the old normal. But geopolitics doesn't run on emotion or promises. It runs on infrastructure. And once that infrastructure shifts, power shifts with it, regardless of who sits in the Oval Office. What's unfolding between Canada and Europe is a textbook example. This shift isn't locked in by political statements that can be reversed. It's anchored in technical, financial, and institutional decisions. A defense procurement contract lasting 10 or 20 years doesn't get canceled because of a conciliatory speech. A command and control system built to European standards can't be easily plugged back in to an American framework without massive cost. And a supply chain that has been rerouted won't suddenly reverse course just because the political mood has changed. For decades, U.S. power in the Western world didn't stem solely from its military or economy. It came from its role as the architect. Washington designed the rules, the technical standards, the coordination mechanisms, and positioned itself at the center of every flow. Allies didn't just buy American weapons, they bought into the American ecosystem. That created a deep form of dependence, often unnoticed because it was wrapped in the language of partnership. Now, Canada and Europe are doing the opposite. They're not tearing down the old ecosystem in one dramatic blow. They're quietly building a parallel one. Standards are being recalibrated. Data platforms are being replaced. Procurement processes are being harmonized. Each individual step may seem small, but together they carve out a new path. And once that path is formed, it begins to reinforce itself. This is what strategists refer to as path dependency. Once an institution invests heavily enough in a direction, the cost of reversing course becomes too high, financially and politically. For Canada, returning to a model of absolute dependence on Washington wouldn't just mean breaking contracts or dismantling new structures. It would mean explaining to voters why their national security is once again being entrusted to a partner that once openly threatened their sovereignty. The social factor matters too. Public trust, once broken, isn't restored through technical agreements. Polls in Canada and Europe show that a majority no longer see the United States as a reliable partner in key areas. Democratic politics doesn't allow governments to ignore that perception. Any attempt to go back to how things were would be seen as a betrayal of long-term national interests. Even if Washington changes its tone, the issue is predictability. Allies aren't just asking whether the U.S. has goodwill. They're asking whether that goodwill can survive through political cycles. When the risk of policy reversal becomes too great, the only rational solution is to reduce dependency. And once that reduction becomes institutionalized, it turns into the new normal. This doesn't mean the United States is being cast aside. America remains a major power, an important partner, a resource no one can ignore. But its role has changed. From the coordinating center, Washington is gradually being repositioned as one of several options, no longer automatic, no longer assumed. Every act of cooperation moving forward will have to be renegotiated piece by piece in a more decentralized power landscape. That's why this shift is so close to irreversible. Not because of hostility, but because of structure. When power has been redistributed, when connections have been rerouted, and when trust has been reallocated, there is no reset button for the international order. And in that world, the United States must learn to exist as a great power, just no longer the singular anchor of the West. For nearly 8 decades, America's leadership role in the Western world was taken as a given. It didn't need daily reaffirmation or grand declarations. Allies followed. not just because of US power, but because they believed that power was used to uphold a shared set of rules. Power and trust moved together, reinforcing one another, forming the stable foundation of the post-1945 order. But that assumption is now over, not with a dramatic moment, not with gunfire or the collapse of a treaty. It ended far more quietly when allies began to ask whether power still came with responsibility, whether today's promises would still hold tomorrow, and whether the rules of the game applied to everyone or only to the weaker players. Canada and Europe have not risen up against the United States. They haven't declared a break, nor are they trying to replace one hegemon with another. They've done something more practical and more profound. They've built a backup plan, and when that backup becomes strong enough, it's no longer plan B. It becomes the default way of operating. In that logic, a power shift doesn't require confrontation. It happens through infrastructure, standards, supply chains, and public trust. When new structures are in place, the old center of gravity erodes naturally. No one is stripping Washington of its power. Washington has forfeited its default position by turning unpredictability into a policy tool. Trump believed that threats would make allies more obedient, that pressure would force them into line. But in a world where nations have options and capabilities, pressure only creates motivation to break free. Allies didn't yield, they diversified. The greatest danger for a superpower isn't being directly challenged, it's being bypassed. When meetings happen without Washington, when agreements are signed without American sponsorship, and when new security architectures function smoothly without the US at the center, power may still exist, but influence no longer flows as it once did. This is not the end of transatlantic cooperation, but it is the end of its automatic nature. No more assumptions that America is always right. No more default belief that America always leads. Everything now must be negotiated, weighed, and situated within a more dispersed balance of power. The world is entering a new phase where power alone is not enough to secure compliance without trust. And when trust is gone, even great power becomes raw pressure, liable to backfire. The real question isn't whether the US can reclaim its old role, but whether Washington is willing to accept a new one, as a major partner in an order that no longer revolves around it alone. That's a hard adjustment, not just for America, but for the entire Western world. What do you think about this shift? Is it a necessary evolution for America's allies, or the beginning of a more fragile order? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this analysis helpful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss future deep dives into the quiet, decisive movements shaping the world today.